Hello and welcome to the second of our two manufacturing debates looking at the future of industrial policy in the UK. I'm delighted to welcome Jonathan Reynolds MP, who is the Shadow Business Secretary, Verity Davidge, Policy Director at Make UK, and Laura McBrown, Managing Director of G&B Electronics Limited, an SME contract manufacturer in Surrey. The purpose of these debates is to ask government and opposition for their view of manufacturing's role in the country's economic future, and for us to express to them some of the key concerns and priorities of the country's SME manufacturers, who, after all, make up well over 90% of the manufacturing companies in the UK. We're going to keep the format of this debate pretty similar to the previous one, in that we'll be discussing the key priorities facing the sector, how to create growth through industrial strategy, the drive for net zero, and the parallel and complementary drive to get manufacturers to adopt digital manufacturing technologies, and of course, skills and training. People, of course, skilled people being the lifeblood of our industry. But before we start, Jonathan Reynolds, perhaps I thought it'd be interesting to hear a little bit about you so that viewers can get a sense of where you're from and hear about your experience of the manufacturing sector. Welcome.
Thank you, Nick. Thank you. Lovely to be here.
So tell us a little bit about yourself. What do you know about manufacturing? And you've been in post 4 months, so I expect it's been a quick study for you.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, first of all, let me say it's wonderful to be making my debut here on Manufacturing TV. But I have had a long association with Make UK. First of all, as a member of the all-party group for manufacturing here in Parliament, but also as an MP who represents a manufacturing constituency. So people might be familiar with Stalybridge and Hyde. That's the map of home I've got behind me. But we're a place still about double the national average of people working in manufacturing in Tameside, which is my borough on the eastern side of Manchester before Derbyshire begins. So we've got some companies like Stepan, Smurfit Kappa, Stamford Group. It's a big part of our local economy. So there hasn't been anything to learn, Nick, in terms of the value of this sector, the importance of it. And to be honest, this has been and is a bit of a dream job for me, because there are many things that I have thought this country needs, both before I was an MP and since I was an MP, and having the chance to develop that industrial strategy for us and for manufacturing on the Labour side is a brilliant opportunity.
Verity, imagine it's day one of a new Labour government and you were sat down discussing what you want Jonathan Reynolds to focus on. What would you say to him?
Well, I think I would normally use the time to do a bit of an elevator sales pitch on the wonderful sector that we represent, that is manufacturing. But I think Mr. Reynolds is well versed in that, so I would use my time more creatively. Again, I think I'd love to be able to sit down and talk about how our manufacturing sector is transitioning to net zero, how it's accelerating digital adoption, how it's investing in its workforce. And all those are true. But if I think I was to really use my time wisely and do a service to our members, I would be saying, look, our members are really struggling right now. They are facing spiralling costs, wage inflation, energy bills, and it is snowballing. And they are coming to a point when they are struggling to keep afloat. So my ask would really be, how can we actually work together now and look at cutting those costs? I know we had very common messaging on attempting to delay the NICs rise. Unfortunately, that went forward. So what are the things that we can do now? I've visited dozens of manufacturing companies in the last few weeks, and everyone talks to me about energy costs, tripling, quadrupling, increasing even more the cost of their business, to a point actually where they're not even breaking even. They're almost making a loss by producing more. So really, how do we work together to make sure we keep this sector that has always remained open and operational throughout the pandemic going, and give it the support it needs right now so that we can actually fulfill those long-term ambitions?
Well, Laura, perhaps if I can turn to you, I imagine you were also having a cuppa with Jonathan Reynolds and Verity. Anything from your point of view that you'd want to add to the shopping list that manufacturers will be presenting Jonathan on day one?
Yes, I think very much agree with everything that Verity has said there. It is a worrying time to be in manufacturing. The costs are supply chain issues, the costs associated with that, the cost of energy, the costs of the extra costs on top of just managing to carry on doing what we've been doing before. We've got clients that are having to redesign products because of supply chain issues. So we're running extremely hard to stand still. And I think in addition to, all the worries around the supply chain, getting what we need and actually managing to claw together enough stuff to get things out the door, there's the added concern about the team. The pressures they've been under for the last few years, the pressures they're under now, the inability to sort of recruit the kind of skills that we need to help us move forward and take the pressure off of them. And also recognising that they are under additional strain with their costs at home. So the travel cost to get to work in the first place. You can't have people manufacturing product from home, so that's a cost that they are always going to have to bear. And the increasing cost that they're paying for their fuel bills for their homes. And, a lot of the people that we support in the manufacturing industry are not at the top of the wage bill. A lot of them are jobs rather than careers. And so how do we make enough money to pass on some of the, help to ease some of the pressure that they're under with the bills that they're facing and manage their mental health through this next phase.
Well, those are indeed that's a terrific point of view from the from an SME, and we're going to get to a lot of that. But I did say we're going to sort of look at the three priorities of growth, industrial strategy, and let's tackle that one first. Jonathan, I'm going to be perhaps a little bit, I hope you don't regard this as mischievous or out of order, but I looked at the Labour Party's website this morning and tried to find what it had to say about industrial strategy. And the last substantive post I saw was Ed Miliband, your predecessor, his speech little over a year ago, saying that Labour is the home of industrial strategy, decrying the scrapping by Kwasi Kwarteng of the current government's industrial strategy. But frankly, since then, not a lot else has been said. What does that say about Labour's priorities when it does come to manufacturing?
Well, Nick, that's probably more of a website updating issue for me to take on. But let me give you a bit of a sense of how I see it and the timescale that manufacturers can expect to see us working on in terms of what they will need to hear from us. I mean, first of all, I see my challenge for the whole job, but particularly for industrial strategy, Nick, like this. I think, there are in this country, and I get to go and see them, sectors, firms, factories which are genuinely world class. I mean, you will know this at Make UK, but members will know this. But this year alone, I've been to Nissan in Sunderland. That's where I grew up. I have been to Pilkington's Glass in St Helens. I'm doing a sort of hydrogen tour of Sheffield over Easter. And it is really exciting. And you go to these places, and what I think, and this relates to the spring statement, I think, how is it that you can see and we know that we can be so good in this country, and yet there is no doubt, if you got, by coincidence, next to me the OBR report into the spring statement, the information in there on growth, on productivity, on real wages isn't just disappointing, it's really poor. It's historically poor, actually, for this country. And so fixing that has to be the focus of my job. And so that's what we're doing right now. So I'll make sure the website is updated, Nick, to reflect this. But working on that industrial strategy, which I hope to publish around about the conference season this year, and obviously have done discussions with Make UK's members in the run-up to that, it's got to be the answer to that. And it's got to address those things which are not just the aspirations we've got, but crucially how to deliver them. And look, I think you don't expect me to be too charitable to the government, but on things like levelling up, well, look, it's a big document. There's lots of information in it. Some of those objectives are actually pretty mild. More people in employment in each region. Fair enough. That's almost bound to happen unless there's a major recession. But actually, on tackling that growth and productivity problem, look, if you haven't got a how to that, those aspirations are no good. And so for me, that's what our document will do, and it will cover every part of the economy. That's my aspiration. So I think of that really in terms of three pillars. I think of the kind of, the strategic sectors, obviously like defence or steel, where there's a fundamentally different relationship between government and industry. I think of what the next pillar, which is the things that industrial strategy has historically maybe dealt with in the UK when it's existed, the things we're very good at, our national champions in terms of aerospace, automotive, pharmaceutical services, financial services, but also very keen as well on what we would call the third pillar of that, which is the everyday economy. So retail, hospitality and social care that employ a lot of people, but actually don't tend to get a lot of attention from government. Now, quite rightly, your members, the members watching this, will be particularly interested in the manufacturing element of that. And absolutely, that's got to cover things like energy prices. I mean, that is the big thing people are contacting me about right now. But also go beyond that. I mean, business rates, a significant issue. We've pledged to really reform business rates using the revenue from the global minimum corporation tax agreement to cross-subsidise business rates, so the burden would go down. We'd have greater reliefs for raise the threshold that people would pay, try and change the incentives around that. So it's a coordination of government policy, and not just, when I hear, members quite rightly talk about energy prices, of course, that is the big issue here and now. But I don't want people to think when we're talking about that on the Labour side, we're doing that in an ad hoc way that relates to the current crisis, important as that is. It has to be a more comprehensive strategy than that. And I know this is a big thing to have as an aspiration, Nick, but my ambition, knowing what I know and representing where I do, is to have a strategy that goes beyond the normal political parliamentary cycle, that gives people greater certainty to invest than we usually have had in this country. I think that the relatively low level of private investment in the UK is a fundamental driver of why the economic performance of the UK has been underwhelming. And so if we can address all that in some kind of institutional form, again, to give people confidence, I think we've always needed that. I think if you look around the challenges of things like net zero, we have to have that. And that shared objective, which is a consensus in the UK around reaching net zero, that should give us the opportunity to do this. So I'm going to be giving a speech on that hopefully fairly soon. We'll make sure the information is updated. But of course, that requires a real partnership between any government and businesses. And that's where conversations like this are vital.
It's really interesting you mentioned that, because Lee Rowley, in our other manufacturing debate, did agree that long-term cross-party consensus on the goals of an industrial policy was valuable, but he wouldn't commit to any kind of immediate consensus that says, we agree that these particular steps need to stay in place to give manufacturers confidence over the sort of average 10-year investment cycle. Are you saying that you would reach out to the Conservatives and to the Lib Dems and say, look, this is important. We need to nail some things down, agree them at a cross-party level and keep them in place and agree to keep them in place?
Yeah, that's the aspiration. Now, whether they will agree to those things, there are examples of where this works quite well. The Committee on Climate Change is a good example of that. The objectives will always be set by the ministers, the Secretary of State, hopefully one day me, in charge of that. But you're trying to bind people in, use evidence, use experts, have institutional bodies that would give it that. And I tease Lee a little bit and come back to him and say, obviously, people will, when I say this to manufacturers, they'll say to me, well, look, we've had 12 years of Conservative government and they couldn't even keep the same industrial strategy in place from one Conservative government to the other. So I get this is not a small aspiration, but that is my aspiration, and I think it can be done. Net zero will require a certain approach from government, a partnership, genuine partnership with the private sector, whichever sort of political side of the fence you're on, because first of all, the objective requires a certain level of intervention by government. I mean, look at vehicle sales, electric vehicle sales aspirations there as an example of that. But it will also require, there will never be enough public money to meet the investment challenge that net zero represents. It's got to be about, is public funding sufficient to lever in that private investment? Is the framework, the regulatory environment, one that makes propositions investable in themselves? I think on both of those counts, whatever good consensus and work has existed so far, they're not where they need to be. So that's what we're coming from. It's not, by the way, it's nothing anti-democratic about that. I mean, net zero is a shared aspiration across Parliament. It's more about how we are going to deliver that. What's the serious stuff we need to do? We know that we've got some success stories. Of course we have. I mean, offshore wind. I was a shadow energy minister in 2015. If you told me the price of offshore wind would get down to where it has got to, I probably wouldn't have believed we could be as ambitious as that. But it can be. But again, look at the capacity we require on batteries to build the same number of cars we currently do in the UK. Now, again, we've a couple of good success stories there, but it's nowhere near. And so let's set the objectives, but let's test ourselves, whether it's a body like the OBR or the Committee on Climate Change that says, great, this is the progress so far, this is what else needs to be done. And I think that would make the political debate not just more effective, more robust, more transparent, but I think that would really help the investment picture as well, which is crucial to getting this right.
Of course, at the moment, we've seen over the last 2 years an end of the globalization, as some are saying. Actually, the era of globalization is over. I characterize it as the shock it created, as we focus too much on just in time and not on just in case. Verity, I wonder if I can ask you at Make UK what your feelings are, your policy is on reshoring, about perhaps shortening supply chains, reinforcing them, making them stronger. And of course, that means holding more stock. It's going to have quite an effect on the sector. What's your view on it?
So, manufacturing supply chains are complex, and a lot of the time they're global. We've just undertaken a piece of work now that we're looking at around even asking the question of how many suppliers does a manufacturer have? In a lot of cases, it's well over 50. Sometimes over 100, sometimes over 200. Some of them just don't know, which then poses a bit of a challenge in terms of end-to-end supply chain visibility. I think what we've also seen, the trends are in the past 2 years, is a big move towards, more closer to home local suppliers. So a larger proportion of suppliers are now GB based. We're not seeing as much even from kind of the EU or even beyond. Looking ahead to the next 2 years, it seems a bit of a steadying of the trend, but we are seeing manufacturers looking to both diversify their supply chain and look more closely to kind of local suppliers. I think a lot of that is on industry itself to make those moves. They can take advantage of use of digital technologies in order to give that end-to-end supply chain visibility. But I also think there is a role of industry working with government and policymakers to learn lessons from the past 2 years, which has shown our supply chain vulnerabilities. We need to undertake some kind of mapping exercise to see where those vulnerabilities are and to make sure that we have the domestic capacity to meet that demand, that actually we can be more self-reliant. I think we've heard a lot of kind of noise from government and a national resilience strategy that we have been feeding into, but we haven't heard much more since then. So for many manufacturers, they're kind of getting on and doing it themselves, but we could probably do even more to make the UK more competitive and support our manufacturing base if we worked a bit more collaboratively with the government.
Laura, the I'll call it the end of globalization is going to become a cliche, but you're a contract manufacturer based in the UK. Are you seeing any change in your business profile when it comes to shortening supply chains? People looking for more localized UK manufacturers.
Yeah, we certainly are seeing an increase in clients reaching out to us to look at reshoring their supply chains into the UK. I think the challenge around that very much comes down to sort of the skills, and I think where companies have put their products offshore for a long period of time, there's also an element where they've kind of lost touch a little bit in terms of parts that have maybe become obsolete in the manufacturing process, and actually the data that they're getting back from their offshore suppliers is not sufficient to enable them to build product sort of more closer to home. And actually they are more deeply embedded with their supply chains than they realized, even down to how they're going to test their own product. If that's been developed by the incumbent supplier that they have and they don't have access to that data and information and can't rebuild those test profile boxes and bits and pieces, then they really are in a more difficult position than they realise. So we are doing work with clients to sort of help them understand where they sit, where their products sit, how that compares to what it is that they've got, because there is an appetite to bring it back. But the engineering skill set needed to sort of understand and almost to a point reverse engineer the data that they do have is not sufficient to cope with the demand.
Well, Jonathan, from what we've been hearing, it's clear that particularly, of course, with the terrible events happening in Ukraine, which are disruptive, and goodness knows how much more disruptive it's going to be, not just for the poor people of Ukraine, but the whole of European economy. Are you sensing, or do you grasp that this is a moment of strategic importance for the manufacturing sector? This is not just business as usual with tweaks, that we're actually facing perhaps a root and branch change in the way we approach our industrial strategy.
Yes, I think the combination of the terrible consequences of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, and actually the pandemic, and what is, I suppose, what I would call sovereign capability, has become much more of an issue. People more aware, much more political interest in it. I mean, I would say I don't believe it's the job of the Secretary of State for business to tell businesses how they should run themselves, and I think the supply chains, the market is responding to these events. But I do think it is the job of the Secretary of State to take an interest in the strength of our sectors, to be a champion of that, to believe we should, as Rachel Reeves says, buy, sell, and make more in this country. And for us, it's not, by the way, about being protectionist or anything like that, but I think in terms of things like procurement, government should take just a more holistic view of value. It's not always about lowest price imported from abroad. It should be about, what is the impact on UK skills and supply chains and opportunities for the future and the prosperity of this country. I think that's entirely reasonable element of any successful industrial strategy. So I think there are some real opportunities, that are out there and happening. I think also there's a part of this that links to that net zero conversation that we just had, because something that I'm very much aware of, always have been representing where I do in Parliament is, we started on this route towards net zero, but there's so much more to do. And if there was a sense amongst the people who I represent, who elect me, that any move through the next stages of net zero meant, for instance, offshoring emissions to make our geographic emissions look good, but it was at the expense of UK industry, and we were going to just import those products instead. Well, I wouldn't be for that, and my voters wouldn't be for that. And I think that would undermine political support very much. And I think we should be just open and transparent about that. We should measure as a country our full emissions footprint, so that would be consumption emissions from imports as well. Because if we're going to produce that framework, that will, for instance, help us get to net zero in industry with hydrogen, with the investment that we want to put in around something like UK steel production, you're going to need a metric, a way to measure that properly. And I think, again, that's just an entirely reasonable thing for any country to do. And I think in the longer term, there will be conversations about, carbon adjustment mechanisms in trade agreements and things like that, which is just where the world will get to. So I think this is very much a conversation, again, some bit prompted by some awful events that people have had to adjust to, but also this longer framework that we're in. And I think as the contributors have said, we've seen some of that evidence of that very much so already.
Okay, I wonder if I could just pick up on one thing, and do forgive me, I've already challenged you about the Labour Party website, but this is perhaps more fundamental. Ed Miliband is the Shadow Climate Change and Net Zero Secretary. You are the Shadow Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy Secretary. That's a Venn diagram that feels to me almost like it's two circles on top of each other. Isn't that a bit duplicative? Why did Labour decide to go down that route, possibly ending up with a classic Whitehall separation of powers?
Well, I'm more than happy to answer that, Nick. I mean, look, Ed Miliband is one of this country's leading experts on international climate change, and has obviously been through many of the international conferences that have set the framework that we're operating in. So to be able to work with Ed in my capacity, it is a huge asset. Now, look, you can slice and dice Whitehall in many ways. Look, let's be frank, the biggest issue for businesses in any country, certainly this country, will always be workforce and skills. And of course, that is done right now from the Department for Education. So we did that differently when we were in government. But people should be in no doubt this is a joint collaborative mission from us on the Labour side. To be frank, the most important relationship for any prospective or actual business secretary is the relationship with the Chancellor and the Treasury. I think we've seen from this government that's not a great relationship, and that's what a lot of members of Make UK tell me, and a lot of the problems, a lot of the frustrations stem from that. So look, it's always going to be a collaborative effort. What people need to assess is, are the people, is the team on each side committed together to work as a team to deliver that? And I can say absolutely, in my case, I've got Ed, I've got Rachel Reeves, I've got Keir himself, who's hugely into this agenda and hugely supportive of everything we want to do. And that's why I can have confidence in the plans that I'm setting out that we're developing. And so people should be, I think, in no doubt how central this is, not just to what we're putting forward as a Labour Party, but how we see the next Labour government being successful, and we can work very much as a team to deliver that.
A question that some SMEs have sort of given us as talking points for this conversation. One of them was around investment, government investing in the future of industry, being seen as investment, which has got value add built into it, instead of being seen as a critique of the current government might say, of it's just being seen as current account spending and therefore has to go when spending cuts come along. Are you able to give us some idea of Labour's policy on that there is investment in the future that generates, as I say, value for local communities, jobs, and of course, we naturally would submit that manufacturing is at the very heart of that because it does produce such well-paid jobs?
Yeah, well, absolutely. So one of the wonderful things for me has been not only to get this job, but to come into it after Rachel Reeves had made that very big commitment in terms of capital spending at Labour Party conference. So I've got the framework, if you like, I've got the envelope to work with, to work out how to deploy that best. And you may have seen the plans we put forward on, for instance, green steel, very comprehensive package. And the numbers behind that and the overall envelope for that, Nick, they're not obviously plucked out the sky. They're based on those two questions I mentioned in the introduction. So first of all, if the challenge of meeting some of these objectives is about, first of all, is the quantum of public investment sufficient to lever in that private investment? Well, that is no in many sectors. I mean, if you take the government's building strategy, I think they've got a figure in there, it's the high 60s in terms of billions of pounds, I think, is required. I think what they pledged so far is about 7% of that. Now, that's an unrealistic proposition. And then you ask yourself, well, is the wider framework one that's going to attract private investment, even if the public investment is not as sufficient as it needs to be? Well, again, the answer to that is no. I mean, I need to replace my boiler at home. I'm probably in the top 0.1% of people interested in public policy around domestic heating and net zero. There is not a readily available proposition for me to do that. And so, being in the position I'm in, I think the crucial thing for us is not just to have a big figure on that level of ambition in terms of investment. It is to make it real in terms of what it means for each sector, whether that's energy efficiency, whether that's steel, whether that's electric vehicles. And that's what we're working on. And again, that's part of the strategy for the rest of the year. I've always thought, to be honest, if you just as a politician talk about billions or millions in the abstract, they don't mean very much to people, but they do, I think, when you take through what it means for a sector, what is required, why that's a good investment for the country. And again, go back to that levelling up part of the government's, excellent branding, but where's the meat behind that? I mean, look, levelling up regional inequality, these are massive issues, but the answers to those things are based on good jobs, right? Well-paying jobs. And we know we have sectors in this country that provide those. Manufacturing is an absolutely top-level example of that. So really, whatever you call it, I would call it industrial strategy. It's got to be about that long-term commitment, that investment, that partnership. And I think, to be honest, that is missing at the minute from the government. There is not a clear route map to those noble objectives. And that is what I think we've got in terms of the high-level commitments that we've made and what we're working on now. I think my job is to make that real in terms of what it means for particular places, sectors, firms, and how we will do that together. But the ambition from our side is absolutely there.
Laura, SMEs often say they don't get a fair crack of the whip when it comes to being represented. So this is your opportunity. Anything you've heard Jonathan Reynolds say reassures you that SMEs will get some of the support and some of the recognition that traditionally SMEs would say they haven't got. I mean, for instance, let's take the net zero thing. I mean, what are the hurdles you're facing in your business in driving out carbon from your processes and maybe one day your products? And to what extent has anything you've heard from Jonathan Reynolds reassured you that under a Labour government, that job might become easier?
There's definitely an appetite in our industry to do our bit for the environment. There's even just within my own business, and I'm sure that I am in no way unique. When we talk to the team about their aspirations around doing our part to reach towards net zero, I'm not short of volunteers in any way, with people with ideas of how we can maybe do things differently and what might be involved. I think that the challenge is understanding how that can be done on a bigger scale. And we happen to have we rent a building. There's a council-owned building in an industrial estate, and we inquired about putting solar panels on the roof. And because that's not what the building looked like when we rented it, when we come to hand the building back, we would have to rip all of those off. So it makes the investment just a waste of time. And for us just doing it on our one little building, there are hundreds of industrial buildings all over the UK owned by local councils, that really maybe there should be a joined up approach with government to put solar panels on top of all of those, and offset, deal with our energy situation and offset some of those costs. And there are ways that we could think about doing that if we all just group together and put our heads together on it. So I think there's, from a manufacturing point of view, we want to do our piece. As SMEs, we are up to our eyeballs as it is. Trying to do extra projects over and above just getting stuff out the door is always a challenge, but the appetite is there, so it needs to be made easy for us to do.
Verity, I thought that was a really fascinating observation. Never has anybody mentioned to me the difficulties manufacturers have if they're renting a council. What Laura's just said, I thought was amazing. To what extent is that typical of what we face, that actually somehow that kind of granular policy is something that needs to be reflected back to government? Because it seems outrageous at the moment that GMB Electronics would have to do that were they to surrender the building.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think a lot of the time we're just looking for a common sense approach to these things. For a long, long time, organisations like Make UK were saying, well, actually, if manufacturers add a solar panel to their building, their business rate bill increases. We've had some of those reliefs announced by government in terms of building improvements, but it's still not quite there yet. As you say, Nick, it's common sense, right? These are common sense policies. We're not asking for anything extraordinary. And I think you're exactly right. Almost when you go into that granular level of detail, actually, government listening to businesses such as Laura's and going out and experiencing and seeing it firsthand is really important, because I can talk about the need to exclude plant and machinery out of business rates bills to drive up further investment until the cows come home. But actually, what's even more powerful is when policymakers go in, they see the challenges that businesses like Laura's are facing, and see it from the grassroots. And I think we try to really, really encourage that. There is a lot more I think we can do in terms of moving towards net zero. Actually, for manufacturing, we've got a big challenge on our hands. To be net zero by 2050, we'll have to be halving our emissions by 2030. That's no mean feat. I think we're seeing progress. We're seeing more manufacturers put net zero strategies within their companies. Focuses tends to be around operational efficiencies and kind of communicating those ambitions to their customers. But manufacturers are also telling me that their customers themselves are kind of driving those moves to net zero. We're seeing more customers ask, we're seeing more suppliers ask. So it's almost kind of forcing manufacturers' hands. But the positive amongst all of that is that a lot of companies are now telling us that they are driving forward towards net zero and looking to reduce their carbon emissions to actually reduce their energy costs, which is Laura's example. So it's industry trying to help themselves, but then policy prohibiting that from happening. And I think those are the things that we really need to remove so we don't see those disincentives.
Yeah, we haven't really touched on digitalization as being an aid to the net zero drive, which of course it is, because anything you can measure, you can't manage what you can't measure, and so on. Quick question to you, Jonathan Reynolds, about Made Smarter, which is the current government's and started by the previous Conservative government to promote the adoption of digital manufacturing technologies. I'm wondering what your thoughts are on programs such as that, which help take some of the sting out of the change. But of course, as everybody knows, it's self-interest. It's just a question of accessing perhaps finance and expertise, which Made Smarter does. So are you a Made Smarter supporter?
Yes, Nick. So, I've only ever heard genuinely good things about Made Smarter. I think a little bit of frustration for me is really that where there's obviously a national objective, politicians of all stripes are keen to see it promoted and used. When you've got something that your constituents, or the businesses you're visiting are telling you it's a success, a bit frustrating. I don't really understand, to be honest, why the government seems less keen to continue it than the people I talk to, are keen to do. So absolutely, I want things that work. I want things that are, they're tested, they're tried, they're going to be good value for money if I'm championing them as a Secretary of State. This, to me, seems an example of that. Now, I do think, and Verita's examples and Laura's are absolutely spot on. There are, I think, one of the things different, right, to maybe 5 or 6 years ago is on some of this stuff around net zero. I think, actually business and sometimes public opinion is ahead of some of the politics and some of the policy around it. And that point about business rates, I often cite that. I think that is an absolutely fair challenge. It goes back to that investability prospect, which is, we're asking people to do something, and the first thing that happens to them is there's a disincentive in the tax system for that. I mean, that's a pretty obvious issue to address. And so I think all of that is legitimate and fair. Some of the stuff we have to do on this at the higher end is very, very challenging. And we'll do it as a country because we can do those things when we put our minds to it, but it's challenging. When you think of it in that spread, that context, things like this, I think we can take action on and do things on quicker. But yes, where there's any programme that people are telling me this is effective, this works, we like it, I would seek to be a supporter of that.
Okay, I'd like to move quickly on because we haven't got a huge amount of time left. And perhaps this is one of the most important bits of all, because, Jonathan Reynolds, what is your party's policy on education, skills and training as far as manufacturing is concerned?
Yeah, absolutely. I think this is the issue. It always, there's many issues, but it's one of the biggest, there's no doubt about that. And it has been ever since I've been involved as a parliamentarian with the sector, with some excellent work being done by businesses themselves, I would say, particularly on the diversity of the workforce and the attempts to, get people to recognise what modern manufacturing is, which is definitely different to old-fashioned perceptions that in the main, I think, have passed, but do exist in some ways. Look, I think for me, I recognise this government has a lot of rhetoric again on skills, that it is a priority in part for it. But I would say we're not there yet, based on what, again, businesses tell me, whether that's how the apprenticeship levy works, where, we're certainly in agreement that some flexibility in terms of how that can be spent would be a sensible way forward. I think, to be honest, I've been totally frank, I'm not being partisan when I say, if I said to a constituent, what do you think of the lifetime skills guarantee? I honestly don't think they'd know what I was talking about. And in the conversations I'm having, our aspiration is really for some form of universal entitlement, which would follow each worker, each person around, and then a system that allows businesses to create the demand, to draw on that entitlement, to use the funds that, frankly, businesses are already paying through the existing mechanisms to give you something that really works. And I think that's a conversation which is not just about how the mechanics of policy works, but in terms of what is covered by that, what kinds of activity are covered by that, how people get and access training. People broadly, they tell me they want something which is not bureaucratic. It allows a sort of straightforward, simple, modular training process to take place that fits in around work. And I think, again, I don't think you'd find any political disagreement around that, but I think we're quite far from that in terms of how it is operating at the minute. Obviously, I work with Bridget Phillipson, who's my education counterpart in the Shadow Cabinet, on that. But I do think this is very much in the main, a business issue in terms of what is required. And I think one of my frustrations is there's quite a lot of resources out there that can be spent better. It's an area actually where, if you look at the quantum, whether that's from the skills programs from the Department of Work and Pensions or the existing amount of money paid in terms of the levy, there's real funds out there and we can do it better. I think it's really about flexibility, straightforwardness, how that is communicated. Be frank, FE colleges have taken quite a significant hit in recent years in terms of their funding, and I think there are questions about making sure they've got the capacity to meet demand as well. But that is how I see the way forward, and I think it can be made a lot better with some tweaks, but also with a much more kind of holistic view to how it should work overall.
It's funny because I know, Laura, you have another story about how at the granular level, so much of what the high-level policy is talking about actually doesn't filter down. You had difficulties in the past with the way apprenticeships and the FE system work. What happened?
So I don't know if this is the correct story, but it is. We put one of our team members, because we're into electronics, circuit boards, printed circuit board assemblies, electronic devices, that kind of stuff. And we put one of our team members onto a local course, and there wasn't enough demand for electronics, so they merged it with the engineering course, so it was more sort of generic. So his 2-year course, only one term of that was actually anything to do with electronics. So I think that the challenge for sort of certainly smaller businesses is around the fact that if you're an Airbus and you can link into your local colleges and universities, they will put courses on that run the kind of things that we need. But in the SME market, we're niche. We're really niche. So I need people that can run pick and place machines to build circuit boards. I don't need people that necessarily can design circuit boards. It's an entirely different skill set. And I wonder whether with the apprenticeship levy, whether for businesses like mine, if we could claim the money for ourselves to put on our own training, because the best people we have are genuinely the ones we've grown ourselves. And there's a lot of time and effort that has to go into bringing those people in, helping them to understand, electronics, the tolerances we're working to, the fact that, the rules around the game, all of that sort of stuff. And that takes a lot of time and effort. If you look back at what we did with apprentices many, many years ago, a lot of the academic, the course side of it and colleges was the theory, but the hands-on learning was always within the businesses. So there needs to be a way for us to sort of fund that hands-on training stuff, particularly when we're talking more about the jobs level than the engineer level. So I think was that what you were looking for?
I was also, there was a time that one of your apprentices they actually tried to hire the apprentice to act as the lecturer the following year. I just thought that just demonstrated a kind of weakness in the structure somewhere.
Yeah, we had real trouble with the teacher. So the guy that we put on the course, there was one point where they didn't have the same teacher for their lesson more than once in at least an entire term. And there were times where they were just there on their own. And it ended up part of it being more like an open university course than it was sort of the actual teaching. And I think some of the attitudes with the teachers was, I get paid more than you, I don't have to do this. And I'm actually looking for another job, so I won't see you next week. So it was a bit of a mismatch in terms of the appetite of the teachers. And I don't know whether we were just unlucky with the college that we picked, but certainly the quality of the teaching.
Shouldn't have to be unlucky.
And I don't think Laura isn't. I don't think she is unlucky. I mean, I've heard from manufacturers before that their first-year apprentices are being taught by their third-year apprentices because they can't attract the right quality of lecturer. I think for our sector, the manufacturing sector is moving at such a fast pace. Our education and training system simply isn't keeping up. To Jonathan's points, I think the words simplicity, flexibility and responsiveness are the things that manufacturers will want, and the training market isn't yet delivering. And I completely agree with Laura. It feels the missing piece is that support for retraining that's not really on offer. There are so many initiatives that government has announced. I spend a lot of time explaining to manufacturers what they are. By the next, in 6 months' time, if I go and visit them, I'm listing off a whole new range of initiatives because they're so piecemeal. Just at a time when Kickstart could have really benefited businesses, government stopped it. So I think that it's back to that long-term, strategy and need. The skills investment is just as much as capital investment. Investing in people and skills will require more of a long-term strategy, and I think that's what we would definitely be hoping for from Jonathan and his team.
Well, with that in mind, time for final thoughts. I mean, much of the conversation around industrial strategy is about funding for support mechanisms, R&D, and so on. And they already exist and arguably could be better managed and better funded as well. Pardon me. But there's an ideological aspect too. I mean, the current government is really being dragged against its small state free market instincts to spend more. But given half a chance, it itself says it will seek to cut public spending. And the scrapping of the industrial strategy demonstrates that sentiment fundamentally, that business really should be taking more of this on its own shoulders. So the challenge, Jonathan Reynolds, is not just to say we'll spend more money, which is easy to say, but commit to that deep and committed partnership with industry vertically, horizontally, and perhaps more importantly, to reflect its interests powerfully in departments you don't control, such as education, the green economy, and net zero. In other words, that it's much more comprehensive, much less piecemeal that Verity has just said. Are you prepared to commit to that?
No, yes, without any question, and I think I have no pushback from my colleagues in having that shared mission, Nick. And I accept your critique of the government in terms of, I think, to me, there's a lot of internal politics driving some of the spring statement in terms of the tax cutting messages coming out whilst taxes rose overall. But you see, I would challenge the government if they were looking at it in that frame, and I would say, unless this country returns to the kind of growth rates we've been used to since the end of the Second World War and even before that, I often say to constituents, 2% growth doesn't sound, in abstract doesn't sound significant, but that's the economy doubling in size every 35 years. So that is quite significant in terms of what people expect, which is broadly that their children will do better than they are. And I think we've maybe got the first generation of British people who aren't going to have that experience. And unless that is addressed, if we continue on the path of the last decade into the next decade, well, actually taxes will rise. There'll be no doubt about that. There'll be less money for public spending on public services. And so I wouldn't frame this as, should we have the state which is doing the right things to promote a sector like manufacturing, or try and focus on a smaller state with low taxes. I would say, you have to grow the economy, and then the proceeds of that, yes, let's have a political argument about that's public services or tax cuts or whatever. I think actually, to be honest, it's more about the distributional impact of that these days, because taxes on working people, I think, are really very high, particularly on lower side of the income scale. But that's the challenge. And I think anyone, whatever your politics or certainly in business, that should be the challenge to government. How are you going to get our economy growing? Okay, look, we're going to stop arguing over Brexit. That's been done. That's happened. But what is the future that will give the British people the kind of public services, living standards and jobs that they quite rightly expect? And it is a change from the last decade. There's no doubt about that. And I hope we can have more of that conversation, as well as, of course, the discussion of the short-term pressures, the energy crisis, huge issues for people, cost of living. But all those relate to me to that big picture. And I am absolutely committed to trying to fix that problem.
Laura McBrown, as an SME, how would a more holistic relationship between government and industry affect a company like yours?
I think there's I think just understanding us and why we do what we do. So if we were in it just for the money, I'd sell the business and develop a gambling app and make money out of people that way. But that's not who we are. And that's not why we do what we do. We do it because we recognize there's a value for what we do for the people we do it for, not just for our clients to help them achieve their potential with what they do, but our community. I've got people that work here for me that maybe would have fallen a little bit out of the academic system, but they are bright and they are creative and they can put things together like you just wouldn't believe. And those people, we have an opportunity to help them achieve their potential. And for me, doing that piece of work, helping them to be the best that they can be, is what our industry is all about. And I feel like it's been so hard over the last couple of years, so difficult with everything that we've done. The furlough scheme's been amazing, wonderful. It's really helped. I can't fault it. However, I will just point out that we do have to make the money back. I am happy to, pay into the NIC's increase. But what I will say is that pushes my wage bill up by 2.5%. And my team don't see any of that money, or very little of it. I recognise that, we've got to pay those bills back. And Verity's heard me say this before, but I'm going to say it again. When you look at the furlough and all that money that came out into the industry, in any other scenario, that would have gone to local businesses, local coffee shops, local football clubs, theatres. We would have spent that money in our local economy. So my team benefited that were furloughed, but I paid the tax and national insurance and pension contributions on that money. I also paid corporation tax on that money. But a huge percentage of that money went to the likes of Amazon, because they were open. So Amazon turnover in the UK in 2019 was 2.3 billion, and it went up to 4.8 billion in 2020. And if they're not going to pay their share of the tax, then I don't see why we should have to pay it either, when we are actually trying to pay the people the money that they need to pay their wage bills, pay their gas bills, and survive and do a good job. So what we need from government is for them to create one rule that fits all, and either they are going to stand up for us and get the money in a fair way, or they give us the opportunity to give it to the people that deserve it, that are working at the coalface.
Interesting. Verity, final thoughts from you. I often hear manufacturers say, look, all we need is just give us the tools, give us a level playing field, and we'll get on with the job. Does that sound about right?
Yeah, I mean, I completely agree with Laura's points. We're often looking for a level playing field. You know, in years gone by, we would be talking about rebalancing, shifting more towards manufacturing, away from financial services. I think we have seen that shift. I think in all of the kind of talk about levelling up, whether we consider it a buzzword or not, actually it probably gives manufacturing a time to kind of shine even brighter than it has in the past 2 years. And I also agree that actually give us the tools and we can make it work ourselves. And don't underestimate, if you want to reach out to local communities and support employees and the cost of living, look to their employers as well. To Laura's point, she is paying that increased wage bill. She has to absorb that in her business. We don't want to get it to such a position where she has to make then difficult decisions. Actually, it's a partnership between government, between industry, and also people and local communities. And I think through that, manufacturing once again has a really kind of powerful story to tell, and it's critical that it's at the heart of any future government strategy.
Jonathan Reynolds, final thought from you. I hope you've got some food for thought out of our discussion.
I have, thank you, Nick, and I always have from Make UK events, and that's why it's a pleasure to do things like this. Look, what I get a sense of, these are obviously all problems we've got to overcome, but I am optimistic for the future. I know what we can do as a country. I think with the right policy framework, we could do even more. We could hit these objectives, and that ultimately would mean what I think everyone wants, which is better jobs for everyone in every part of this country, the kind of jobs you can build a family around, build a life around. And if you can have good jobs for people, a decent place to live and decent public services, I think as a government, that is a long way to fulfilling the objectives that we've got. So I'm going to continue to be working with you, like members like Laura as well, and making sure that what we are trying to do is genuine the framework that is necessary for that further success. So it's a pleasure to take part in an event like this.
Well, thank you very much. And that does indeed bring us to the end of our manufacturing debates. Many thanks to Jonathan Reynolds MP, Verity Davidge and Laura McBrown. We hope that provided much food for thought and a platform for an ongoing discussion that will drive home the importance of manufacturing to the UK economy. On behalf of Manufacturing TV and Make UK, I'm Nick Peters. Thank you very much for watching.